Welcome everybody to this latest event from the Rec Code Manager. Today we are hosting a webinar focused on rec parties in the lead up to the go live of new performance assurance dashboards coming onto the Rec portal soon. We are focused on rec parties today, and I say this because there is another session coming up later this week on Friday, which is focused on performance assurance dashboards for rec service providers, a slightly different angle. So if you happen to be a service provider and not a rec party, it may be that you've come along to the wrong one, and you may benefit more from Friday's session, and we'll discuss that, and the gents will discuss that later on the call today. And indeed, if you're a rec party and you signed up for today's and for Fridays, we might be able to get an hour back of your time on Friday, because it's unlikely that you'll benefit from attending both, because while there is a slight difference in the approach, the content generally is pretty much the same and tailored for that area of the market. Okay. We're using Slido today to gather your questions and also to gather feedback at the end. If you haven't used Slido before, it's really straightforward to use. If you've got a smartphone, you can scan the QR code on the right hand side there with your camera and click on the link. It will take you directly into our meeting space on Slido, or you can go to slido.com, type in the code that's on the screen there, and that will allow you to answer or ask any questions of our presenters, which will then gather and take at the tail of the meeting. You also have the opportunity as well to upvote your colleagues' questions, so that anything that's particularly relevant for you or for a great number of users will be promoted to the top, so we know to spend our Q&A time prioritizing those questions that are most valuable to the most amount of people that are on the call. So please do join us on Slido to ask your questions. You can also raise your hands on Teams using the raise hand function if you do have any questions or have a particular aversion to using Slido, or if you just want to really get your voice heard on the call. But our preference, just so we can gather everything, keep it in one place, and have a good record of the questions asked afterwards, would be if you could kindly use Slido as a first port of call. I'll revisit the code and the QR code later if anyone hasn't had the opportunity to navigate there quite yet. Right. So the presenters today that you're going to be hearing from are on the screen there. We're all from the Rec Code Manager team. 4 of my colleagues from the Performance Assurance team, Andrew, Lewis, Ben and Anton. Myself, Paul Rock, I'm the head of communications within the Code Manager team as well. I will have spoken to many of you before in terms of the role that I have, sort of heading up the Rec Code Manager events team. But after I've done my intro spiel, I'm gonna turn my camera off and shut up and let the experts from the Performance Assurance team take over and take you through the detail of the meat and two veg of what today's is all about. Okay. In terms of housekeeping, I did mention previously, if we could keep our videos and mics switched off if we're an attendee, if we can keep them switched on if we are a speaker, so that our guests can see our faces and certainly microphones so they can hear our voices. Otherwise, we won't be very effective at doing our presenting jobs. We are recording today's event both for you guys, so that you can have a record of what you've heard today and look back, but also for those who weren't able to join us because of prior commitments. All Rec Code Manager events are recorded, and we make those recordings available on our YouTube channel and upload links via the Rec portal within sort of 2 to 3 days following the meeting. So hopefully by the end of this week, and certainly in this week's weekly bulletin, which goes out on a Friday morning, you'll be able to find a link to today's recording for you to access and share with your colleagues. I've mentioned Slido. And it's through Slido that we're going to pause at the end of today's demonstration to allow you to ask your questions. I think that's all the bits of housekeeping that I need to go through. In terms of the agenda today, I'm almost done, and after I'm done, I'm going to pass over to Andrew and Ben primarily, and they're going to be taking you through an introduction to what the dashboards are, what the different tabs within the dashboards are, how you get to them, and then demonstrating the tabs that you will be able to see as well before we pick the Q&A. So I think that's my bit done. So I'm going to turn myself off camera now and pass over to Andrew and Ben to take us through the rest of the session. And as I say, if you have any technical questions, please raise your hand so we can address them. But otherwise, if you can ask your questions via Slido, we'll keep an eye on that from there. Thank you very much. Speak to you soon.
Great, thanks, Paul. And if it's clear we've got to a body of questions and we need to sort of pause and answer those, then obviously jump in and let us know. So afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining this afternoon and giving up some of your time. Hopefully this will be a useful session to give you some sort of guidance and sort of preview, I guess, of the dashboard functionality that will be available in the portal. We are currently targeting for this to go live next week, but obviously we're sort of still in the final closure of kind of defects and testing. So obviously it'll go live when it's ready to do so at the same time. So we'll send out communication once it is live, but at the moment our expectation is this will be going live next week. So as Paul's mentioned, today's session is really to talk you through what are the dashboards, what's in the dashboards, where do I find the dashboards, how do I get access to them, how do they work, what are some of the things that I can use them for. We're going to be focusing primarily on that from a dashboard kind of functionality point of view, as opposed to necessarily getting into the details of how some of the wider performance assurance data is gathered and reported on. So obviously the dashboards are an output from that. We've held previous webinars that cover some of those topics, and obviously we can share the links around to those. So this is much more about the kind of the how and the what of the dashboards today. I mean, no doubt we'll sort of drift onto those topics, but just to sort of set expectations there. Also to mention, as well as the recording from this session, we will be holding a post go live drop-in session next week, scheduled for next Friday, which is really an opportunity, assuming go live goes as we hope it will next week, for people to just come and flag any initial kind of challenges or questions that they've got around sort of getting access, or any questions they've got on the content. And then we'll hold a further drop-in in a few weeks' time, once people have had a chance to explore the dashboards a little bit and may have questions. You'll obviously also be able to speak with your OEMs as a first port of contact, as with many things, and your OEM will be able to view your dashboard as well as you, if you see what I mean. So OEMs are able to see what you see as a party. And obviously then if there are questions that can't be supported through that initial contact, obviously that can come to the performance assurance team, who can engage with you on specific items, whether it's about how do I do X, and or I've got questions about the underlying numbers and data that the dashboard is showing me. And we certainly do anticipate in the sort of I guess sort of, what's the phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant type of world, there will be some things that as you look at the data you might say, oh, that doesn't quite match up with our understanding of where we are on a particular metric or particular process, and we very much welcome people coming back and saying we think that looks different, so that we can understand, well, why is that? Is that something that's in the data? Is it something about what you're seeing on your end and there's a discrepancy there, and we have seen that in the past, or is it an opportunity where we can further tweak and refine metrics? So we do kind of welcome that engagement with parties to make sure that we are making best use of the performance assurance data available to us. So in terms of the session today, we've got a couple of slides, and then we'll basically dive in, and we're going to go into one of the test environments and show you the dashboards live. So Ben will be doing the driving for that, and we'll talk you through much of the detailed functionality. Just to say, everything you see today is test data, it's not real. There might be occasions where in the test environment you see real party names, not particularly in the dashboards, but more widely. None of the data you see is anything to do with those parties, it's just their placeholder names for different bits of the portal test environment. So nothing you see today is actual performance data for a party, but we will be looking at the dashboards as though we were a party. So essentially the view that you will all have. We're going to talk through 7 individual dashboards, and they're on the slide at the moment, and I'll talk to those in a second. We will also, as we go through each one, just give you a little bit of information on the access that PAB members have to essentially the equivalent dashboards, but where their access is a little bit different to party members, obviously in their role as a PAB member, so that you have an understanding of what is it that PAB members and performance assurance team members have access to and are using when we're looking at the data. It's fundamentally the same data, you know, in the simplest possible terms. Effectively, you can see across multiple parties when you're a PAB member or in the performance assurance team as a party. Your ability to do that is clearly more limited, and only where that has some sort of peer comparison type elements to it. The 7 dashboards that we're going to talk through are, first of all, to the overall summary. Well, I should say actually the first 3 all relate to retail risk measurement. So you'll be aware of the risk register. Again, you'll have interacted with performance assurance team members, many of you before, on aspects of retail risks and individual items that we measure within that. And those 3 dashboards essentially give us different views of that data. So the overall summary, kind of does what it says on the tin. It's that very top level view. As a party, it's probably not a dashboard that you'll spend a great deal of time in. It's of more value to PAB members, where they can compare parties across particular parts of the market, for example. So they might look at all suppliers or all DNOs. But we think it's important that you see what they see about you on that dashboard, if you see what I mean, so that you've got that visibility. I think that transparency is important. Over time, we may introduce an element of peer comparison within that dashboard, but on day 1, you will just see your data. The retail risk summary then essentially, again, kind of does what it says on the tin. We try to keep the titles fairly clear, but that gives you basically a view of performance at a retail risk level. So there might be several different elements being measured underneath a particular retail risk. This is taking that up to that sort of overall retail risk level. Again, if you're familiar with the risk register, not every retail risk is measured through the data, so not every retail risk will appear in the dashboard, but those that are measured with data, or at least in part, will appear, and obviously also relevant to the type of party you are. So some retail risks are relevant for suppliers, some for network operators, for example. And then risk driver summary is essentially a layer below that. So that's then down into the more detail of, okay, what are the specific drivers that are being measured within that. So that's when we really start to get into the weeds of activity. The 4 other dashboards then on the screen there. So number 4, meter specific topic monitoring, looks basically at a whole series of compliance measures within the meter operations schedule. Probably the most relevant to MEMS, but also there are some supply measures within that. That's what that one does. Peer comparison is a dashboard that is for sharing of anything where we're applying a peer comparison performance assurance technique. So Rhonis switches would be the obvious example there. SMIS survey gives you the results for those who this applies to of the quarterly SMIS survey information, so similar to what's provided in the current SMIS reporting, but you're able to obviously go through and have a look at that. And then finally theft, which basically gives you a view of the submitted thefts for those who are in the theft incentive scheme that you have submitted and have been accepted year to date, and also a view of on an anonymised basis how that looks across the market as a whole. So that information very much the same as you receive currently on the monthly files that you receive, but it's just a more visual way of seeing that data. If we maybe go on to the next slide, thank you, Paul. So I kind of touched on this already, but in some dashboards you see just your own data. In other dashboards you see your own data and you see anonymized data about other parties. So effectively the first 3, as it says on the left there, you just see your party's data. And on the remaining 4, you see both your data and anonymized data for other parties. So again, similar to if you're familiar with looking at something like the erroneous switch peer comparison at the moment would be a good example of that. And on the right, we've just given an example of how that looks, and we'll see this as we go through as well, of course. So on that right-hand chart, test supplier 319 is the real supplier name. So in this view, I am test supplier 319. And sort of, if that was Andrew Energy Inc., for example, then that is what it would say as the description. So you will see your actual party name within that particular chart, and you'll see it highlighted as you can see there as well. The remaining parties will all be there with a 5-digit number, obviously assigned at random. You'll be aware, you already have a 5-digit number, you'll be aware of what that is through some of the existing anonymous reporting that we've done. And so you will see that. So obviously every party sees essentially the same data, but every party sees a different line of data, if you like, unmasked and tagged as your data. And obviously all of the data remains anonymized. The other thing I should mention in terms of I've used the word party obviously there a few times, and you may recall at the go live of REC, there was an opportunity, and by the way, this opportunity is not, was not one and done, but we asked parties whether they wanted to be treated as a party for the purposes of performance assurance, or whether they wanted to group a number of parties together where they had multiple parties in a sort of corporate group. If you have not elected to group, then you will be displayed at a party level. So your party as per the party register, so not at an MPID level or a shortcode level, but at a party level as it exists in the party register. If you have said, actually, as a corporate group, we want all of our parties to be grouped together, then you will see a dashboard at that grouped level. Now, you're able to change that decision. It's not an instant button, you don't press it and it changes. But if you either have grouped and you realise you, in retrospect, didn't want to group, or you didn't group and you realise, possibly not straight away, but as you use the dashboards, that you would actually find it more useful to be grouped together, then you can submit a help desk ticket that will come through to the performance assurance team. We will make that update, and then there's a little bit of process that needs to happen around that in terms of setting up sites and things, and then your dashboard will move over to a grouped basis or kind of unwind to an ungrouped basis depending on which direction you're taking that. So you don't need to make that decision today. Don't worry about rushing into anything, but just to be aware, you will either see this data at a party level if you've not done something else, or if you've previously elected to be grouped, then you'll see it at a grouped level. It is just those two choices. I appreciate there are some corporate groups where you might say, I want these 3 supplier entities, but not this one, for example. We obviously have to try and find a model that works kind of reasonably simply and kind of universally. So we've just got those 2 options, group or no group. We don't have a sort of custom combination option at this stage. So there we go. Final thing probably to say in terms of that is, and I mentioned it on the or it was mentioned on the previous slide, this is obviously an initial release of dashboards. We will expect that these over time will change. We'll obviously see how parties engage with them. We'll no doubt hear from you in terms of feedback. And over time we will identify the need for new dashboards if, for example, new performance assurance techniques come in and we need to surface those. So this is a first cut of dashboards. We think it will be really useful for parties. We've been using variants of these with the PAB and the performance assurance team for a little bit of time, not these dashboards, but kind of the predecessors, I guess you might say, for some of these to help us in our work. So we hope they will be useful for you as well. We do welcome feedback. If you do have feedback and comments, do please provide them once you start using the dashboards. Again, easiest way to do that is just via either your OAM or submitting a ticket. Now, equally, we can't promise, obviously, to make every change that people would like, as I'm sure you'll appreciate. There's a wide range of users and a wide range of stakeholders using these dashboards. But obviously, the more feedback we get, that helps us to understand where, you know, either things are working well for people or there's a real consensus on a particular aspect, which helps us to prioritize that ongoing improvement activity. So with that said, I think we've got one more slide, which is just on, I guess, a bit of a logistics point. So how do you actually get access to these dashboards once they go live? So we'll show you in a second where they will sit in the actual portal. But there is a separate role that you need to be assigned to have access to this. So, and that obviously allows you to, you know, choose within your organization, if you're the MAU, you know, who you want to have access to this and who doesn't have access to this. It's not all or nothing. So as a party, you need to give access to the REC Performance Assurance Dashboard Viewer role. If you happen to be a service provider as well, then you would give access to the Service Provider Dashboard Viewer role. It's a separate set of dashboards, or a separate dashboard really. And you know, you can do that separate to having REC Performance Assurance, which is an existing role you might be familiar with, which, for example, gives you access to upload files. So, you know, for example, if you've got a group doing the upload, but you don't want them looking at the results, then you can give them the performance assurance role, but don't give them the viewer role. Those roles are not yet live on the portal, but they will be obviously going live before the dashboards are available or at the same time. So late this week, probably they should be available, if not early next week. And obviously you can go ahead and, you know, kind of assign those roles to users, and then obviously once the dashboards become available, they'll have access to those. Your MAU, probably your first point of contact to do that, and obviously your contract manager if not, and then if you're struggling, obviously go via the help desk and they'll be able to support. But that's the same as assigning any role in the portal. There's nothing different there. I'll just pause there for a second, just in case there's been any initial. I've not seen any hands or anything go up, Paul. If there's been any major questions, no, that's great.
No hands and no questions yet on. Oh no, one question that's just come up on.
All right, there we go.
Actually, and the question is, please could you recap on how we have access granted to view these dashboards and the go live date? Do we need to request them, and will a communication be sent?
Okay, so let me cover a few of those things. So how you get access to them. As a party, you need to be given access to the role that's up on the screen there. Your MAU can do that. So every party, if you're not that person, if I'm not talking to the MAU for your party, every party has a master admin user who essentially is able to grant other people within your organization access. So your MAU can give whoever in your team you want to have access to that access. If you don't know who your MAU is, then I would probably suggest speaking to your OAM in the first instance, or your contract manager if you know who your contract manager is. Sometimes the contract manager and the MAU are the same person, but that obviously depends on individual parties, how you've chosen to allocate those responsibilities. Once you've been given that role, every party will have access to these dashboards, and we'll show you in a second where they physically are in the portal. In terms of go live, we are targeting that next week. I'm not going to give a specific date, just because we obviously need a few final, testings, sign-offs to go, and ultimately go through a go no go decision on that. But we absolutely will communicate with you once the dashboards are available. And as I say, we've got a post go live session booked in for Friday, so I sincerely hope it will be going live before Friday, otherwise I won't be able to have a post go live session on Friday. So we're targeting, as soon as we can do next week, but obviously equally, we want to go live with something where we've got all of the ticks, and we're all happy with, kind of the finalisation of the testing, or kind of any defects that need to be resolved. I hope that answers the question. If not, we can obviously revisit as we go through. So I think
just a related question, sorry, that's been asked as well around whether the MAU will be given instructions of how to provide access, or whether that's quite straightforward. And
so they should already know how to do that. It's a standard. So it's nothing special to do with dashboards. It's the same as giving anybody in your organisation access to any role within the portal, and that's kind of one of the roles of the MAU, is to manage that for each party.
Does it currently work, Andrew?
Paul, I'm aware that there is an issue with some some users. So it seems that some MAUs, for an unknown reason at the moment, don't have the ability to add roles or create users, but that's been today flagged up as a priority issue with the developers for investigation. For the majority of users, it does work, but there's a small number of users for some reason are having some problems. But that's fine. A request into the service desk, and we will set them users up on your behalf if you're struggling as an MAU to create a user.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Paul. So yeah, so should be standard. Obviously, if you have any problems, help desk definitely your first point of call, and it's quick for them. Should be quick for them to resolve that. So, and I'd say yes, we will absolutely. I think what the intention will be is we'll send out some specific comms to certainly all contract managers, and I think probably everybody who's registered for the webinars as well, to say they've gone live. It will also go in the newsletter, of course, but obviously, you know, some people will look at one thing or another. So yeah, okay. So what I think we should probably do at that stage then is move off slides and move over to actually looking at some dashboards. So Ben, you probably need to take over as master of screen.
Yeah, can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, we can see that.
Yeah.
Yep.
That was good. Brilliant. Thanks,
So
Ben.
I've basically logged in here as an RPA user, as you can see, as a test user. So this is the landing page for the portal. I'm sure most people are familiar with this already. In terms of then going towards my dashboards, I'll slowly go towards that point there. So first of all, going as a party here, straight to party operations, selecting that as we would previously. We can then select performance assurance out of the options that appear on the screen here. And if I do that, I'll see my list of organizations I can access here. So in this case, I'm going to go for this top one here. Again, this list should really be one per party, but again, if you've done the ungrouped method, you might see multiple parties appear here.
Oh, sorry, just got a question from Philip there.
Oh, sorry.
Philip, go ahead.
Sorry, having problems getting off mute there.
No worries.
So you've shown there where you go in and it drops down with multiple parties, which will have got grouped together.
Yeah.
But if the dashboard's going to be at the group level effectively,
yeah,
how will you decide
so
which party you go, which one of those choices you make there?
Yeah,
I'm just thinking for us, we've got a lot more than two.
That's fine. Yeah, so let me see if I can cover that for you, Phil. So first of all, I've mentioned before that this isn't really British Cat and Ball, by the way. It just happens they were near the top of the alphabet, so they got picked. So hopefully anybody from those organisations doesn't feel picked on here. It's not your data, don't worry. This is the screen you see, and some may be familiar with this, some maybe not. If you have multiple performance assurance areas, which is essentially where you've got multiple parties. If you have one, and I'll just cover that. I appreciate that's not your use case, Phil. Then you will go straight through. Essentially, you don't get this screen. If you have more than one organisation, so that will be typically where you have multiple parties, then you will pick which party you would want to look at. If you have chosen to group, as well as the parties, the individual parties in this list, there will be an entry which is your grouped party. That should exist today. And it is that entry that you will see your dashboards against. I mean, you can go in the other ones and have a look, but there won't be any data there. It'll work, but it'll just say, I've got no data to display. So it'll be fairly obvious that you're in the wrong place, if you see what I mean. If you've got a lot of parties and you're at all unclear as to where it's going to appear, just drop us a line through and we'll happily confirm for you, exactly which party name we have as your grouped one, and just make sure that everybody's on the same page with that. The kind of party register grouping, there's quite a lot of detail, and obviously as things came together in the rec from the separate arrangements, there's quite a lot of kind of data harmonization that need to happen there. So if there is anything you're unsure about, which one is it going to be under, just do drop us a line, give us a shout, and we'll happily say to you, you are here. And obviously if for some reason that doesn't seem to be right from your perspective, then again we can just sort of work through, well, why is it we've got it that way around, and if that's not right, what do we do about it? But that will be whichever organisations you have access to today. So we click through. Thanks, Phil. Click through onto not really British Gas, but they happen to be near the top of the alphabet. So you'll be familiar with this screen already. This is, well, you might be, sorry, I should say. So this is where, for example, you upload data, where if we've submitted an RFI to you, for example, or you're doing your annual maintenance activity. But the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted there's a new item on the far right, which Ben, I guess you want to go to, which is dashboard. So hit that, and just below, after a second, we will see the dashboards appear. And that is essentially how you get to the dashboards. So that is where you want to be. And then everything now is in this page. So at the bottom of the screen there, which Ben should scroll to, you should see a series of tabs, and that's obviously the tabs that we talked about on the slides before. Obviously, it sits within the dashboard. We've tried to get the sizing of this so that it'll work again, across a wide range of kind of screen sizes and things. You can obviously zoom in and out, and we'll go through as we talk a couple of other ways that you can kind of focus in on one particular area. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, and perhaps the more technical, you'll have spotted the little yellow icon, which, if you're familiar, is the Power BI icon. So behind the scenes, this is Power BI. So if you're familiar with Power BI, if you use that already in your organization, and obviously it's a pretty common tool, then this should feel familiar to you in terms of how some of the functionality works, how you can navigate and so forth. So if you are familiar with it, then obviously that just gives you that little bit of context. So first dashboard, as we talked about, we're on the overall score dashboard here. So as I say, this is probably one that, in all honesty, if I was a party, I probably want to know where I am on it, but it's probably not one that you're going to spend loads and loads of time on. But just to explain briefly how this works. So we've got a big heat map on the left hand side there, and that is showing two data points. So the y-axis is the highest risk score. So and you might be familiar, or hopefully people are familiar with this from previous webinars, but when we measure the risks, we normalize the scores, and essentially 0 is the best score in inverted commas that you can have, so it indicates you've had no deviations on that particular measure. And the sort of the higher score, the bigger the number gets, the kind of the more kind of either risk triggers or non-compliances that we're seeing. So that effectively gives you the y-axis plot. The x-axis is then, again, we've run sessions on this previously, and we can share all these webinar links around if people don't remember them. The PAB sets thresholds for the majority of the risk drivers. I say the majority because not all, and there's a number of CSS ones that have obviously only gone live recently, so they need to be refreshed. Those thresholds are essentially an indication to us in performance assurance that the PAB is interested in that level of performance, and therefore some action should typically be taken. Those thresholds consider 3 elements. So they consider the score, they consider the period of time the score has been at or above that particular level, and they also consider whether there is a more than trivial number of processes or activities. So, for example, if we were measuring erroneous switch resolution, the threshold might say, it's anything with the score over 0.5 for at least 3 months and at least 50 erroneous switches each month. So it kind of tries to, kind of not overly sensitized to very small spikes or small volume things. And that effectively then gives you a single data point to put on the heat map. And then for the party view, we're then showing the history of that. So, we're looking at data for June 22. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning, up in the top right. I don't know, Ben, if you just want to point at it with your mouse. So up on the top right, this will always default to the latest data loaded in test. June happens to be the data month, but that'll be the latest available data will be kind of displayed by default. In this case, it's June, and we can see for this particular party, actually June 22, they're in the orange zone. Again, Ben, I don't know if you want to just point towards that dot. Previously, actually, that party has been sort of sat on the left-hand side, so they've not had things over threshold, but clearly in June, something's gone over threshold, or multiple things have gone over threshold, which has pulled them to the right. and obviously they've stayed sort of towards the top. And then down in the bottom right is some sort of contextual and sort of other performance indications or performance related data. So these are typically pieces of information that help provide some context. PAB members will often ask for some of this information on the party as a whole. So some of it is, for example, what sort of party are you? If you're a supplier, do you supply domestic or non-domestic? And then there's also some other indications. So, for example, did you complete your maintenance qualification on time? Have there been any instances where data has not been provided? Are you in CME? So forth and so on. So now some of those things often, obviously don't update on a monthly basis. So, for example, your maintenance qualification is an annual process. So, we can't update that value every month. So there's a third column there which says, when was this information last compiled? That's really just there as sort of context information, so that when either performance assurance team or PAB members are looking at a particular party, they've just got some additional context as to activities and status of that party. So purpose from a party, I think, of having this is really twofold. One is you'll obviously be interested to see where you are in terms of the heat map, but probably most importantly, really, so that you've got that visibility of, well, what is the information that PAB sees about me, and if you think there's anything wrong in that, or you've got any questions on it, obviously it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, we want to raise that, understand what's driving that. Let's get into that, and obviously we'll be able to see some of that in the later dashboards. Couple of other features that are probably just worth talking about, which you'll see across a lot of the dashboards. So the first is in the top right hand corner, there's a big eye. If you hover your mouse over that, that will just give you some further information. Some of the descriptions are longer than others, but essentially, what is it that I'm looking at? And then if we come away from the eye, you'll see on the right, now there aren't that many filters on this particular dashboard, but every dashboard has a filter pane on the right hand side there. Click the button, that pops out. And then you can obviously put that away. A couple of things to highlight in there. One is that reset filters button in the top right. So if you get yourself essentially lost, if you get stuck, if you've managed to filter your way into a blind alley, if you hit that reset filter, you'll go back to the initial view. I'll come back to the hand in a second. And then obviously the filters themselves there. So in this case, we've just got a simple filter, which is the assurance period. And that would obviously allow you to go back and look at, what did this look like in a previous month. Let me just pause because I saw a hand pop up on the screen. Mark.
Afternoon, everyone. Mark
Hello.
from Central. Can you explain to me why the coloured scoring along the axes doesn't go up to red? Don't you think there's a situation whereby you can have a low percentage but a high normalised risk, or a critical normalised risk, or is not that the intention of?
So I think the colouring is, I guess, a way of, I guess, sort of drawing the eye. So for example, if you were, let's say, well, there are certain boxes it's probably very, very hard to get into, to be honest. So if everything was over threshold, you would have to have a certain level of normalised score to really have got there, to be honest, because the thresholds use the normalised score. But let's say you were kind of, far over on the x-axis but not very high on the y-axis, which I think would be the scenario you're talking about. That doesn't necessarily mean that you won't have activity taken, in terms of from a performance assurance point of view. In fact, you definitely would, because if you're over threshold, that effectively is the PAB's way of saying to the performance assurance function, we expect you to be doing something here. Now, there are areas where we might take action where things are not over threshold, see trends or patterns, for example, happening. But if something's over threshold, we pretty much need to either be doing something or be very clear to the PAB, this is why we're not doing something, if you see what I mean. So the colouring is, indicative of an overall, I guess, kind of performance trend, and clearly the top right you would be kind of scoring high on everything and you're over threshold and everything. So I think kind of red feels kind of logical enough there, but it's really just to give a kind of a visual to the chart, rather than there's not a specific you know, yellow means X and orange means Y type scenario. It's more just a kind of visual look and feel.
Okay, I was just making sure that
Yeah.
performances that you were trying to show here, they were all inclusive, as it were.
Yes.
I was wondering whether or not you could have such an extreme situation, but it wouldn't be covered on this particular.
Yeah,
diagram,
no,
because
so
it would
the
be out of
shut the
that
roll
scope.
scenarios, as I say, one of the things we absolutely, you know, anticipate will happen, and one of the reasons we're keen to have the dashboards and everybody to have access to the data, right, is, you know, this data gives us a view of performance. It's collected from parties directly, from central data sources, you know, DFlows, data from CSS, so forth and so on. I think everybody would recognize that data gives us a picture. Sometimes it doesn't give us a complete picture. And often one of the first things we'll ask when we do see what appears to be performance challenges within the data is, you know, the first part of our RFI will almost be, this is what we're seeing, you know, are you seeing something that is dramatically different to this, you know, from your perspective? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the data is wrong. You know, there are lots of reasons for that, but, you know, the intent would typically be to say, you know, okay, we're seeing this in the data, we need to engage with the particular party or group of parties, depending on what the particular matter is. Part of that engagement is always obviously about making sure that, you know, the data reflects what is being seen consistently by all stakeholders, and, you know, kind of that interpretation of the data is being made correctly. And, you know, sort of there may be occasions where, you know, what it actually does is it throws out, you know, okay, actually there's a problem with the data, or, you know, the way that's measured, you know, in terms of the data doesn't reflect exactly how the code's been set up or whatever it might be. We do have a process, so before data goes into the dashboard, we go through a sort of review process, shall I say, on the data, and there have been examples, obviously haven't affected dashboard publication until now, but there have been examples where we've identified that there is a problem with the data, and therefore we've said, okay, well, we can't use that data right now for performance assurance because we know, for example, it's incomplete. You know, something's missing, something's gone wrong somewhere in that process of the data being pulled together, and that process will continue. So dashboard, so again, you'll all be aware, data comes across to us at the beginning of the month. We run through obviously our processes, we go through a validation process, we look at what the data is telling us. That feeds in then to the PAB cycle in terms of the papers and activity, as well as obviously activity with parties in terms of performance assurance. I guess a sort of new step in that process in some ways is, once we have reviewed the data, we will effectively say, is there any reason we shouldn't publish this to the dashboards, i.e. make it available in this form, and through all the rest of the tabs that we're going to see today. There may be occasions where we have to say, okay, we need to pause, or we need to hold back a certain group of data. We had an issue a couple of months ago where there was an issue with some of the data from the DTN that was coming through. So it was, you know, just giving us all sorts of weird and wonderful numbers coming through. Equally, you know, you can obviously take verification so far. It might be that we think it looks good, we publish it, and then you say, no, that really looked wrong to us, and then we engage with, you know, particular parties, and it turns out there is something there. So, you know, there's always the sort of the need to have that dialogue. If you look at it and go, that just doesn't feel like the reality that we're in, and you know, that, showing you the data is obviously an important part of having that conversation.
Thanks for the clarification, Andrew.
No worries, thanks, Mark. So what I suggest we do is, Ben, have you got the PAB version of this quickly? Just so that you are, so as a party, you won't see this, but I just think you might be interested to know, well, what would the what would a PAB member see? So the user we're logged on is both a PAB member and a party, so can see both. So very similar looking, but obviously a little bit different. And I guess the big difference here is you'll notice that there are lots of dots on the heat map, but there are then a list of suppliers in the bottom right. And if we select one of those dots, maybe one of the bigger ones, that's then got, you know, a number of suppliers are, you know, in that blob. If we select a different one, Ben, so maybe one of the ones that's got 1 in it, if you happen to know one, that's got 1, and then as a PAB member I could go into the individual party view over on the right hand side, and they will then see essentially the screen we just saw. I don't think we picked the same party, but they'll see the screen we've just seen, and you know, that sort of metadata that we talked about. I don't pick the same party there. You got the wrong one.
Yeah, doesn't matter. They'd see the same view anyway.
Yeah. So okay, something slightly missed there, but they'll see that view that you saw. So you know, this really is to give visibility to PAB members, and obviously what they'd be looking for is, are there clusters of parties that are in particular areas within that heat map. There we go. So if we go back to the party view, Ben. So what I suggest we do is we'll move on to the retail risk summary. As I say, these first 3 dashboards, it's all fundamentally the same data. What we're doing is we're sort of peeling the layers of the onion away. So similar layouts. Again, at the top, we've got the month, we've got the eye for some further information. We've got that filter pane on the right hand side. This time it's got a few more filters in it. I'll come back to data set status in a second. And then what we've got here is basically a breakdown by the retail risks as per the retail risk register. So up on the top left, first thing we're doing is we're saying, are we going to look at the dashboard based on thresholds, or are we going to look at it based on exceptions? So essentially where there's either a risk indicator or a non-compliance. So we default to looking at it by threshold, but as I mentioned, not every retail risk has a threshold, so both options are available, so you can see that. What we've got then in the table underneath is, what are the retail risks, what's its name, what's its threshold. Obviously the real text isn't there, but you sort of get the idea. And then going below that, over time, okay, what's been happening in terms of performance against threshold. I suspect this has probably had some thresholds forced in for June for testing purposes, because typically you wouldn't see that kind of shape. But to be honest, if we saw that shape, that's exactly the sort of thing where we would then be talking to that party and saying, you know, performance has been great, and then suddenly it's not, you know, what's going on there. So we've got, you know, graph over time in the bottom left. Up in the top right, we've got a breakdown by each of the risks, and we can see which is the retail risk reference, how many of the risk drivers. So each risk has multiple drivers. So for example, that might represent multiple steps in the process. All of that details in the risk register, and you'll see it again later in one of the dashboards. And excuse me, you know, the number against obviously gives us that view. If we just flip over to the number of exceptions for a second, so here we're looking at drivers over thresholds, so they're kind of in 1s and 2s and 3s. Here we're looking at number of exceptions, so these may or may not be over threshold, but nonetheless there's an indication that there are, you know, there are some performance items. So you know, again, we can see that broken down over time in the bottom left across all risks, top right by risk, and then bottom right is the same data essentially in tabular form. We can filter across the different things, again, if you're familiar with Power BI. So let's say we were just interested in one of the risks, we can click on that, and obviously things like the time chart will filter. So if you want to dive into the detail, you can do that. And again, you can click away from that to come back. A couple of other things, and Ben, keep me honest if I miss some things here to mention. So one would be in the filter pane, if we can just expand that out. So we've got a few filters here. So again, we've got assurance period. We've got party. Party is there mainly for PAB members because they have access to more than one. Obviously, you'll only have access to your party. Retail risk, we can filter here. We can filter it by clicking on the chart. It just depends on which you prefer to do. Has threshold is a simple either yes or no. So, or placeholder as it currently says. So that essentially is if you just want to look at risks that have thresholds defined, you can do that. And then the bottom one I just wanted to spend a moment on. So at the moment, we've got the current version of data available. So that is, we're looking at June 22 and we're looking at the current version of June 22. So in terms of how that works, in July, we collect the data, in 1st of August, should I say, we collect the data. On June, we go through the process, so forth. So in August, we would have published the dashboard with the June data in, because that allows for that 1 month of lag period for data collection and then obviously processing. In September, although the latest month is then July, we also reprocess June data, because in some cases there may be data updates that flow through. Obviously, some processes can take more than a month to operate. So we'll always have within the dashboard 2 versions of the data available, the current version and the prior version, and then obviously the next time a current version is published, the prior version drops off the bottom and sort of cycles through. Just we forget, you know, having too much data is not helpful. The reason we're having both is that obviously around the time of the month when dashboards are published, which is around the middle of the month, it's slightly tied to the PAB cycle, so it's not a fixed date, but we will notify people when dashboards are refreshed. You might have been doing some work with in a particular dashboard on the data for a month. If we refresh that and the numbers move around a little bit, that's obviously not necessarily going to be helpful for you. So the idea is, if you've been working on, if you've been working on a particular data set, you know, you're taking activity, you're investigating something, whatever it might be, when we publish the next set of data, you can still see the previous current version, which obviously now becomes the prior version. So by default, you'll always see current version, latest month. But if you do want to go back, that facility is available to you. As I say, primarily there just so that you sort of go, hang on a minute, that number was 27 yesterday, and now it's 29. What, you know, what's changed? If we just come out of the filter. And then I mentioned this before, maybe use the time chart for this, Ben. If you do want to see something bigger, maybe you're working on a small screen, or you know, you want to just spend some focus on it. There's something called focus mode on many of the graphics. You'll see that little button there. And if we hit that, essentially just puts it into a full screen mode. So, you know, if you want to just look at one particular item, you can do that. And then you can go back. Button placement might just need a little bit of work. And that will take you back to the dashboard. Again, if you're familiar with Power BI, nothing new there. But if you're not, it's maybe useful to know that that's available. So I'm going to move us on to the third of the risk-related dashboards, and this is probably the one that, as a party, you might spend most time in, particularly if you're in the detail looking at particular items. And this is the risk driver dashboard. So bear in mind, we've got retail risks, and then underneath retail risks, we've got risk drivers. So typically, most risks, will have multiple risk drivers, either because there are for example, different processes that relate to, you know, for example, there might be one process for prepayment and one for credit meters, and they sort of combine up to an overall risk, or there might be multiple steps in an activity, which, you know, we're looking at each of those individual drivers because we want to understand what's going on. In fact, if I use an example, erroneous switch would probably be a good example. So we've got a risk driver looking at the rate of erroneous switches, and we've got a risk driver looking at the resolution of erroneous switches. They both contribute to the erroneous switch risk, but they're individual drivers of activity. So this now is starting to get into a bit more of the detail. So again, let's just sort of walk around. So again, the common elements are there: the eye, the date, the filter panel. Hopefully you're starting to see the familiarity there. So then what we've got, so we're looking here, I'm a single party, and we're looking here at June 22, and at the moment we're looking at all the risk drivers that we've got data for in this particular party for this particular data set. So if we start at the top left, we've got number of what we term processes assessed. So essentially that's the population of things that we've looked at. So that could be switches, that could be, completed switches for things like erroneous switches, for example, or for switch meter reads. sorry, excuse me. Or it could be if you're a MEM, it could relate to, for example, meter installation. So it's the population effectively. We then measure all of the various risk drivers using this kind of minor, major, and there is fail, although we haven't got any fails defined currently, fail score. So essentially, if we see a deviation away from the expected, or if it's a risk indicator, we see something that's a risk indicator, and I'll give an example of that in a second. Something is either a minor or a major. Typically, a minor is used when it's kind of an initial issue, an initial non-compliance, or perhaps something that's late but completed. And a major is where, for example, something has not been completed. So again, if I use the erroneous switch, a minor would be, you know, there was an erroneous switch, it was resolved, but not in the timescale, but it has been resolved. Whereas a major would be there's an erroneous switch and it's not been resolved within the required timescale and it remains unresolved. So, you know, kind of a more significant issue. So minors and majors, they go towards the normalized score. So a minor's worth 1, a major's worth 5. Not every risk driver has majors, some only have minors. And we use minors as well for risk indicator measures. So, for example, in switching, we measure things like the objection rate. So how many objections versus how many completed switches has each party gone through. Now, clearly there, you know, the presence of an objection is not de facto, you know, an indication of a non-compliance. Clearly, you know, you're entitled to object to a switch. That's why the process exists. But what we're looking for there is behaviour that's outside of the norm. So we have two sorts of measures. Some are compliance, some are risk indicators. So we see in the top right, number of processes, number where there wasn't a minor or a major. So essentially the percentage. That gives an overall normalised score. Got a number of minors, as I've just explained, the number of majors. We do have an option for number of fails. So fail is like a really hard immediate non-compliance, not currently in use in the risk register, but the facility is there. So it's available to us in the dashboard. If I then kind of walk across, we've got a summary by risk driver, including whether it's above threshold or not, number of processes, so that goes to the 14,000, how many exceptions there were, so either minors or majors, and what the score was for that. And again, there are some little eyes on some of those, which again, you know, every time you see an eye, there's basically a mouse over to give you a little bit more information if you need it. Across the middle, excuse me, we've then got how does that look over time. So we're looking at June 2022 performance period, but we're then looking back at the history of that over time. So even though you are looking at June, you are actually seeing some performance information for previous months with the position as of June, so the latest available. And we can look at that in terms of risk score. We can look at that in terms of minors by clicking on the relevant button, or majors. And again, you'll see a line chart of how that's gone. All of that filters as you click around, as we saw on the other chart. So if we were to filter down to a particular risk driver, for example, using the top right table, or using the bottom left chart, which we'll come to in a minute, I'll just let you extend yourself there, Ben, then you'll see the other charts change. The donut gives you a breakdown of, you know, effectively the same information that's in the KPI tab, so how your passes, minors and majors look. And then the bottom left chart, so the bar chart with the line, that shows you for each of the risk drivers, just move the mouse away for a second, thanks Ben, your score. The grey line shows you the maximum score, because some risk drivers can go to 5 and some can go to 1, so it kind of shows you how close you are to being in a kind of fully risk state, I guess. And then, as Ben just did there, if you mouse over, you get a lot of information in the pop-up. Remember, that's placeholder text at the moment, but effectively it will tell you what the risk driver is, what your score is, what the maximum score is, and then some descriptive information. So what's the name of the driver, you know, what's its kind of description, what's the threshold that's being applied, whether there is a threshold, and kind of what's the purpose of the driver, like what are we ultimately trying to measure there. That also displays in the bottom right for the most significant risk in that chart. So you'll see 5.2 there. is the biggest one on the chart. It's also the text down in the bottom right of the screen as Ben's mouse is just pointing, or was just pointing towards. Thank you. As you then filter, so if we were to, for example, filter to 12.2, which sadly I know is an erroneous switch one, it then filters that table. So if you do want more detail, clicking on that chart is quite a good way of getting to that and seeing what the detail is. The final thing that I'll highlight here is we can drill down one further level. So if we select in the top table there a particular risk driver, you'll then see that drill down arrow becomes available. That wasn't available before. If you click through on that, you'll be taken to a final tab that you can't see in the tab, so you've got to drill to this, and that gives you the detail for that specific risk driver, and that is down at a meter point level, where that's a meter point level defined metric. So that has the information, the particular meter point, whether a major or minor, what the issue was, some details of what that was. So the idea here being you can go in and you can actually look at, you know, and go and have a look yourselves at the data in your systems. Now, an important point to note is the data in that table, if it's from DTN data, is actually a pseudo-anonymized meter point number by default. So Electric essentially maintain a pseudo-anonymization process, and we actually have the data at pseudo-anonymized level by default. We're just actually working through the best way of managing that. By default, we will leave it pseudo-anonymized, and if you then need to know the real meter points, you'll need to come and ask us to anonymize it for you. And we'll include a little indicator, because there are some data flows where we do have the meter point, somewhere we have the anonymized meter point. So, or sorry, some data sources, not some data flows. If as a party you say like we always want the meter point, then we can arrange that we will systemically de-anonymize it for you before it goes into the dashboard. It's important to say only you as a party have access to this tab. So no other party has access to this. PAB members don't have access to it. It's just you as a party and the performance assurance team, obviously, in terms of doing our role. But PAB members don't have access to meter point level data. Just you as a party does. So if you do want us to de-anonymize, then it would be just for your purpose. But the idea is obviously it allows you to go in and really get into the detail of, well, I thought we were doing well on that particular process. Like, let me go and have a look at the specifics. And hopefully that will allow you to engage better with the data that's available. So if we go back to the previous dashboard, Ben, maybe just pop out the filter pane. So similar to before, got assurance period, parties we talked about. Obviously, you can then drive down not just to risk, but to risk driver level. Again, we've got that above threshold indication, and the current or prior data set. So for each period, there's always a current and a prior. So for June, there's a current and a prior. If you go back, say, to May, for example, well, there isn't a prior loaded, but if you go back to May, ban on the assurance period, just for a second, just to show people how that works. So what you'll see then is that obviously all of the data in the dashboard changes in terms of the scores. The line chart will still show you up to June, but for example, you'll hopefully spotted the number of processes has changed, the bottom left chart has changed, so that's showing performance to May, and that's clearly at the top of the page, so you always know which month you're in. And if we go back to the filters pane and we're just a bit confused as to where we are, just hit that reset button, and that will take us back to the kind of the landing page you ended on, which, as I say, will always be current or latest available period, should I say, latest available data set. So that's always the thing you want to look at. So that takes us through the 3 risk dashboards, obviously increasingly detailed, depending on, I guess, your role within your particular party. I would imagine probably if you're into the detail of performance assurance, this is probably where you spend quite a bit of time, possibly the previous tab as well, in terms of understanding your own performance and sort of seeing what we're seeing. And this is the data we see. So again, this hopefully allows you to see what we're seeing, and you know, if you've got questions on it, or if you look at it and you say, oh, you know, I thought we were doing well on that particular area, or, you know, maybe we knew we had a bit of a problem there, but we thought we'd improved, but we're seeing we've not seen that come through into the data yet. Hopefully that enables those sorts of conversations to take place with a fact basis. So I will move us on, unless there are there's any hands. No, we'll keep going. Peer comparison. So these are probably getting a little bit simpler now. Actually, that was probably the heaviest dashboard. So if anybody needs to have a quick sort of sip of coffee. So peer comparison is a technique we can use for lots of different things, but the main thing it's used for at the moment is around erroneous switches. But on the screen there, again, similar layout. So we've got the month in the top right, we've got the eye. So in the top left, we've got what performance measure, what peer comparison measure are we looking at? And if over time we add more and more peer comparisons, that will essentially just become more and more boxes. In this particular data set, we've got two versions, both erroneous switch peer comparisons. Essentially, one just removes some of the solar related noise from the mix. Now we here are test supplier 319, which, as I say, is like our real name. So if you're Andrew Energy, then it would say Andrew Energy there. And so, you know, our performance is there with the green box around it, as we showed before. And it has, if you like, my real name. For the remaining parties, what we've got is that party number box. So that will be every other party in the market relevant to this peer comparison. But you won't know, obviously, you know, who's who. We can then have a look at that based on obviously the overall ranking, which is the top right. So to a certain extent, sort of the league table, as it were. Below that, in the bottom right, is, you know, the same data pretty much in a table. The additional information that you can see there is how that's changed since the previous month, and also how many items have contributed. So in this case, we're measuring erroneous switches per 1,000 switch requests. So, you know, for this particular example, there's been, if my eyes don't deceive me, 45 exceptions. So that's a total of 45 erroneous switches, which obviously are divided into however many switch requests has been, to get us that overall score. And the reason really to have that is it just helps to you know, understand whether there's a party who's got, you know, a high score but actually one exception, so effectively got a very low volume of activity, so it's, you know, kind of a little bit of an anomaly, or whether there's a bit of volume there. So, you know, that's the information, and then on the bottom left we can see how's that changed over time. That's the average. So that's the average across the market, or the, you know, the group of parties that are in that particular peer comparison. Again, if I wanted to just see mine, I could filter on my supplier, but I don't know if you want to click on test supplier 319. So there, now I'm just seeing, you know, my performance rather than the market as a whole.
Andrew, there's been a specific question asked about this graph, so I'll take it now. Can you just provide a little more clarity about what that average peer comparison number, for example, in this case, 26.29, what does it mean? What does it refer to?
So every peer comparison is obviously defined. Now, the one we're looking at the moment is, as it says there, is the number of erroneous switches per 1,000 excuse me, switch requests. So, i.e., for every 1,000 requests, test supplier 319, which is, you know, Andrew Energy, if that helps you think about it, has had 26.29 erroneous switches. So if they'd done 4,000 switches, they would have had about 100 erroneous switches. I won't do the 104 point whatever, or 105 point whatever. If they've had, you know, 1,000 switches exactly, then, well, wouldn't have been possible because you can't have 26.29 erroneous switches, but you kind of get the idea. So it's whatever the measure is that we're comparing across all parties, So in this case, essentially it's an erroneous switch rate. Peer comparison is a generic technique, and the idea with the dashboard is it's been developed so that if we introduced a new peer comparison, we don't have to build a new dashboard. We would use the same dashboard. What we would essentially then see is another box would appear in the top left, and we would be measuring that. So for example, if we were to say, we're going to introduce a new peer comparison, there's this new process in switching around annulment, and we want to see how different parties are using it within the market. We might say, okay, we're going to calculate an annulment kind of rate per switches, and again, we're doing it in that case per switches because it's a switch event driven thing. Or we might say, sort of if we sort of try and do something outside of sort of outside of switching, it might be to do with some of the customer facing switching and billing issues schedule. So 30 is it, I think. We might say, okay, we're going to say how many, for every 1,000 customers, how many inquiries do you have going through ASTEP that require resolution? So we've got to define a measure for a peer comparison that we can calculate for everybody, and then the number is whatever that measure is. In this particular instance, it's essentially an erroneous switch rate number. If there was another peer comparison, it would be whatever that particular number is. I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, feel free to jump on the mic and tell me.
I think there's been a follow-up, but perhaps the person who's asked the question might be able to elaborate. But the question is, how would you then compare yourself with other suppliers, or when you position yourself against others? But I'm not sure whether the person who asked wants to just further clarify.
I'll give a second and go somewhere.
Yeah, sorry, that was me. I just wanted to know on the right-hand side table, average peer comparison result by party.
Yeah.
So for example, for the purpose of this exercise, we supply 319. So
yeah.
How do we compare ourselves to the others on the list, or where we?
So in this instance, the party we happen to have picked is essentially, top of the table, which is kind of bottom of the table, really, I guess, in the sense of, this is so you can see, what your score is. You can obviously also see how different it is to those around you. So are you very similar? So say, for example, we were looking at, let me just pick another example. Say instead of being that top one, we were, say, the one that's labeled as party 14923, so 45th down in the or rank number 45. I can see, okay, well, there's actually 2 or 3 other suppliers who've got quite a similar rate to me. Yeah. I can see kind of how far away I am from the, kind of the top party, and I can obviously also see how far away from the bottom, and also how I'm changing over time. So am I pretty stable, or am I changing? And but I don't know if you want to extend your session. And what you can also do, as we talked about with some of the other tabs as well, is if you expand the filter pane out, you can also go back and look at this historically. So although we've got a time-based chart on the left-hand side there, you could also say, well, actually, I want to know what this, what was this like last month? What was it like the month before? Kind of where was I in the ranking? And you can do that by expanding out the filter pane. I'm not sure if we've lost Ben for a second there. And being able to sort of do that. So what it's telling you is, your score is whatever it happens to be, and if you're not the top person, you won't be the top row in the table. You'll be wherever you are in that ranking, and you'll have that kind of green highlight, and therefore you can understand how you're compared with others.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's all right. No worries. I'm just going to check whether we've lost Ben or not, because I've lost the video.
While we don't have him,
we can take some questions.
There's a couple more questions. Yeah,
go for it.
So question here: it would help if the unit of measurement was clearer next to the 26.29 metric on that one.
Yeah, and I think the challenge there is because this is designed to allow for lots of peer comparisons, the measure is sometimes going to be different. So I take the point, but there is a reason why it's done in the way it's done. But yeah.
I think we might have Ben back.
I think we might have Ben back. Yeah.
Hey everyone, sorry about that.
Let me just reload this one.
Yeah, you keep going. Paul, if there's another question, we'll cover that as well.
You might have covered this and it was missed.
Don't worry.
But however, where do you get your data from?
Lots of places. So in all seriousness, if you want to really get through the details of all the data, the place to look is the park. That defines all the data that's used for performance assurance purposes. To answer it at a high level, some data is provided to us by parties directly. Some data is obtained from other sort of central sources in inverted commas. So flows over the DTN, for example, or data from CSS. We also have data coming in from service providers, although that's more to do with their own performance, so probably that's relevant to here. But all of this is the data that comes in through the park, and we've run separate webinars. Just no problem with the question, but I'm conscious we could spend 2 hours talking about the data and the calculations. We have run separate webinars before that talk a bit more about the wider kind of performance assurance data and calculations and so forth. So perhaps if we share the links to those out after the session as well, people might want to kind of go back and have a refresh on those, and obviously then work out whether that was sort of answer the questions you've got. I obviously appreciate people will have joined parties, left parties, change roles, so not everybody will have seen every webinar, and obviously if it becomes clear once the dashboards are up and live, we need to run a further session to take people through that again, then obviously we'll set that up and we'll run one. So but yeah, it's a variety of sources, and obviously seeking to try and collect centrally where we can, because obviously minimises impact on parties, but obviously there are cases where we can't do that.
Thanks, Andrew. There's some more questions, but I think Ben's back now, so we'll take the rest of the questions at the end.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Paul. So let's step through the last 2 or 3. They're probably a little bit quicker actually, and then we'll make sure we leave some time for questions. So meter-specific topic monitoring. So this is in some ways a kind of peer comparison, and actually the point around data is probably quite relevant here. So this is basically measuring a whole series of metrics, KPIs, as we refer to them up in the top left, that are defined within the meter operation schedule. And many of these were previously measured kind of pre-rec by Elexon. So just in case you're kind of familiar with those things. This is one where, and some parties will be aware of this because we've been having some conversations around this, where there are some challenges with measuring some of this data, because in some cases, some of the activity happens, particularly in parties who have multiple roles. So perhaps you have a MEM business and a supply business, where data is not flowed over the DTN and is flowed between kind of internal systems through other means. And that's not non-compliant. The RAC says you can, but you don't have to use the DTN. And this is an area where we've already been having some conversations with parties around, we ideally would have done everything off what's on the DTN, because obviously that's the easiest for everybody. That doesn't prove to be possible. So what are the alternative options, and we're continuing some engagement around that. So this is one where we know there are some challenges with the measurement, but this is the best available view we have at the moment. So there we go. So this works very much like the peer comparison. I think the party we've selected here is not actually a MEM. So all of the data is anonymized here because they don't have a role in any of these activities. But effectively, the only difference you would have if you were a party who was involved in undertaking some of these activities is you would see the green highlighting of your name in the way that we saw on the peer comparison. And effectively, initially, this is looking at every single KPI. But in reality, what you would probably do is you would say, okay, I'm interested in some of the specific KPIs. But I don't know if you've got a good example to show. If you're back online now, thank you. So, for example, there we'd say timeliness of asset installation for half-hourly meters, and we can then see performance in the top right by party. Same thing in the table. So some people throw a graph, some people throw a table, and then also how that's varying over time, which is a little bit choppy, interestingly. And And again, we're looking at June. If we looked at that and went, well, that's interesting, May's a lot lower, what's going on there? We might then go into the filter pane and we might say, okay, well, actually, I'm going to go look at May's data and understand, well, actually, you know, what's driving that. So, and, you know, interestingly there, we see for top 4 parties essentially drop back. We drop back a little bit, but you know, kind of really it's driven by those 4 there. So, you know, if we were looking at this from an assurance point of view, you know, we'd probably go and talk to those parties first and say, well, you know, what happened there? You know, there's a dip in performance. It seems to have come back. You know, what drove that? You know, particular activity. I don't know if you want to just pop out the filters again, Ben. So just go back to default. So again, similar filter pane, and then you can also filter. In reality, the primary filter probably here, actually, if you come out the filter pane, Ben, is on the KPIs themselves, and you know, got each of the descriptions there. So, and you can select multiple KPIs if you want to. If you just click and hold down Shift or Control, Ben, I can't remember which.
It's Control.
Thank you. And it says that in the little eye. So you don't have to remember. So, you know, if you want to sort of look at a clump of KPIs, because they tend to be a little bit grouped. If you're familiar with that part of the schedule, it's like, you know, there'll be 5 or 6 about installation, 5 or 6 about fault resolution, so forth and so on. So quite a simple dashboard, quite a lot of data behind it, but effectively we're measuring in each case a specific item that's in the meter operation schedule. If you're familiar with that, it's quite a lot of specific rules, primarily around timeliness of certain activities happening, and it's, as I say, it's got the detail in there. I'll move on to, I'm going to try and aim to finish with about half an hour to go for questions. So move on to SMIS. So those of you who are involved in smart meter installation over the threshold will be aware of SMIS. So there's a quarterly survey that you undertake or have undertaken on your behalf around the installation activity, and this basically has the information from that. Again, this works in a similar kind of way to a peer comparison. So you see your data. Again, we're back here, we're test supply 319 again, so we can see how we're doing, and we also see the rest of the market, but on an anonymized basis. So up in the top right, we've got the period we're looking at now. Because SMIS is a quarterly process, obviously the refresh of this data is slower. Oh, that's slightly confusing because I can see myself. So first things first, I don't know, Ben, if you can get rid of that video. First things first, you know, top left, are we looking at domestic or micro business? You can look at both, but obviously some parties only serve one of those 2 markets. Let's assume we're going to look at domestic here. Then you've got the question that's in the survey, so that's in the drop down. If we just expand that drop down out for a second, Ben. So you'll see each of the questions that are required under the survey, and then if we within the survey, there are some questions that are dependent on the previous question. So if we go, for example, to question 4, so question 4 says, did the installer or technician offer you any advice on how to use energy during the visit? And then if yes, you then go on to 4A to say, well, you know, okay, they offered the advice, did you take up the advice? So for those questions, what you'll see is a little table underneath that just shows you the cascade. So question 4, we had, in this particular case, 6,757 yeses. So yes, the installer offered energy advice. In 5,443 of those, you took up that request. And then 4B, I can't remember the exact wording of the question, but essentially as a follow-on to 4A. There you go. So if you did it take into account your particular circumstances? So because you're essentially funneling, it's useful to know what the yes question was that you're funneling from. So that information is just provided there. And below that, you can then see for the particular question you're looking at, what are the yeses, what are the nos, and there's also a don't know in SMIS surveying. So obviously that gives you that answer as well. You can then see in the table on the right, you know, the performance across and where you sit. Sorry, I should have said before, but on tables you can sort them. So at the moment, this is sorted by supplier name, but for example, if I wanted to sort by the nose, I think I've just done that, Ben, there you go. So there's the little black arrow, and you can sort that ascending, descending just by clicking on the top title. So you know, if you want to look at that in a different way. Top right is the only thing that goes across surveys, so that's showing you how has this question changed over time, and it always measures the yeses. That's typically the kind of the positive response, I guess, in the survey questions. If you are doing both domestic and microbusiness installation, then you want to start at question 1 because that's a common question, and you can then say, do I want to look at domestic or do I want to look at microbusiness? And then obviously if I'm looking at microbusiness, I'm looking at, so in this particular example, our test party doesn't do microbusiness installation, so there's no entry for their data, but I can still go in and see the anonymized performance of microbusiness more generally, if I was so inclined to do, for whatever reason you wanted to do that. And then finally, we'll go on to the theft summary. I've realised one thing I said we would do as we went through, which we didn't do, which is talk about PABs, but we'll go back and do that in a second. So final one, so this is people in the theft incentive scheme will be interested in this particular summary. So again, this gives you all market view with your data particularly highlighted. And we've got effectively three sets of data across the top, and each one has a table, a line chart, and then a breakdown into relevant subcategories in the donut chart. So first of all, tip-offs. Again, we're looking at whatever the latest assurance period is by default. So we're looking at June here. So how many tip-offs were there in this month? How does that compare to last month? How's that been changing over time? And then for the current month, like where are the tip-offs coming from? So, you know, gives you the breakdown there, and you can, you know, hold over as you can with other charts. Then we've got investigated thefts. Numbers are very similar between tip-offs and investigated thefts because we don't get told about tip-offs until investigations have started, but that's just a feature of the scheme. But I guess therefore what's interesting probably there is the donut, which tells you about, okay, of the investigated thefts, what's been the outcome? So what's been confirmed, what's not, you know, what's been confirmed as not theft. And there's a couple of other breakdowns in there in terms of like, we aren't supplier anymore, and you know, it wasn't a theft, it turned out to be, you know, a faulty meter. And then finally we've got the confirmed thefts. So this is, you know, how many thefts have been confirmed, and is it a complete or a partial bypass, which are the two thefts that you're allowed to register. So that gives you an overall position. So all market, and this is a cumulative scheme year to date. So if we look at June, this is all of the thefts we've had reported under the scheme year up to, in this case, the June data. So, you know, if you're looking at this by default, you'll be seeing essentially whatever the latest position is. Really, I think this is useful for two reasons. One is it gives you an understanding if you look at your data. So in the table below, you can obviously find your entry. I don't know whether our test suppliers got an entry or not, Ben. Can't remember whether we had one or not.
No, we're not on this one.
Okay, so we haven't submitted any thefts as our test supplier, but we could find our entry, and importantly, therefore, we could say, well, how many thefts have been recognised by the performance assurance code manager, and therefore, if for some reason there's a discrepancy between what you think's been reported and what's been counted, obviously, you know, got an opportunity then to say, well, why is that? You know, let's investigate that, and that's typically a data quality thing. But then also you can get a sense of what does the overall performance under the scheme look like based on data reported to date. And obviously that's relevant because the way the scheme mechanism works, as those who are part of it will be aware, is that it's a relative performance scheme. So, you know, if you're doing well against your target, but everybody else is doing really well against their target, you probably want to know that. Because the way the incentive pots work means that you would then be paying in. Equally, if you're not doing so great, but actually doing a lot better than everybody else, then that would be in your favour. So this obviously allows you to keep an eye on that. It's worth bearing in mind that obviously it can take time for theft data to come through to us, so it can be a little bit lumpy as things catch up, and we do see that during the scheme year. But this is the available data we have, the best available at the time. And just finally to say on that bottom chart, we can go between month or year to date, as indicated on the left. So either what's been my performance this month, what thefts have been confirmed for the month. Again, we're in June, or what's the year to date position for the same data. So if you want to see, and as you can see, it's split by fuel and by whether it's residential or commercial, because they're different incentive pots. And you can obviously filter that either by clicking in the table or using the filter pane, as we've seen on the other dashboards. Ben, I'm conscious I've ended up probably doing more talking than I'd intended, but once you get me going, were there any things that you think I've missed as we've gone through there that you were sort of thinking, why haven't we shown that?
No, I think it was all good from
Great.
my side. I think it was nice and clear. I guess,
Okay.
and we
I
highlighted
guess Paul will tell us in a
differences.
minute with his questions, right? So
Yeah, well, we'll find out.
just before we do that, because I said we would do this and then neglected to actually do it, is all of these dashboards, yes, all of these dashboards are available to PAB members as well in their role as PAB members, and probably worth just touching quickly on how it differs for PAB members. So I don't know, Ben, if you want to just flip tabs onto, if you've still got the PAB one open, you might need to, relog in on it. But so this is really just for information, on the basis that you might be interested to know how the PAB, or what the PAB sees.
Do you have a dashboard tab in mind, Andrew?
Well, we talked about the first one. I thought we'd just click through really quickly the other ones, actually.
Yeah.
Do you want to just minimize my video just because it's over the corner of the...
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So retail risk summary looks pretty similar. The main difference is that as a PAB member, I can see it across all parties. I'm probably typically going to take more of a which is the risk area that I'm interested in type perspective on this. Otherwise, very similar chart, very similar dashboard, and the party names are visible. So where it says test supplier number, that is the real name in the real world. So that would say, not to pick on people, but British Gas, Good, Shell, etc., depending on obviously party names, and proper party name. I've obviously used the short versions there. Risk driver summary, which was the detail one we looked at. So again, very similar. You can see that across all parties. So we'll see obviously typically all the risk drivers, because obviously some parties have all of them. Can focus that in then obviously on a risk driver view or on a party view, depending. The one big difference you'll notice is that in the top right, there is no drill down option. And as I mentioned before, so PAB members cannot go down to a meter point level on this. They're at this level only. So obviously no requirement for them to be able to go and look at individual exceptions. They can look at individual suppliers, they can look at individual risk areas. What they can't do is go and look at individual meter points. In that, obviously the volume of data for them is much higher. And then the others, perhaps just dip into one of them because it's essentially the same theme on all of them. They're very similar to what we've just seen as a party. Really the only difference is that, again, hopefully you're getting familiar with the kind of the way we've got it set up in the test data now, is now I can see all the parties. So for that question before, I think Julia, you asked, how do I know how I'm comparing with others? As a PAB member, I can look and say, well, actually, who are the others? Like who are the parties around? It is worth saying that under the performance assurance framework, there is the allowance for PIT comparisons to become anonymized. So as in, essentially, the whole market would see this. So you would know not only whatever position in the table, but also who's around you. When PAB says that they want that to happen, and that's the governance process for that, is the PAB has to approve it. then you'll continue to see the dashboard in the same way, but you'll then see real names rather than the dummy names. So just quickly, I thought it'd be worth just touching on that. And then for the other three that we're not clicking in here, so meter-specific topic monitoring, SMIS and theft, again, really the difference is that as a PAB member, I can see all the names of the parties, whereas as a obviously as a party, you can only see your name and everybody else is anonymized. I'm conscious that gives us about 20 minutes left in the session, and I would assume, Paul, you've got some further questions.
Yeah, there's a few questions that are coming.
Excellent.
So if I go over and share, I appreciate it might need to flip back to you again, Ben, but if I flip it over to the questions so that we can see those that are coming.
No, that'd be great. Thanks.
All right, there's only 4 questions on here at the moment, actually. We've addressed most of them as they come through, but back on the screen now, you've got the QR code. If you haven't been on to Slido yet, you can get back on there using that QR code or the code at slido.com. So plenty of opportunities still to ask your questions. So
Shall I just knock them off as they are on the screen?
Yeah, why not? Let's do it.
Perfect. So first one, so suppliers see their input into their name. So on the dashboards, you'll see your party name as it is in the party register. I know for some people that's sometimes slightly different to, you might be trading as or whatever, but yeah, you'll see your party name. The only other people who'll see your party name will be PAB members and performance assurance. So if it's not, if you think it's not quite right, then hopefully that's not too much of an issue. But yeah, it's party name, and party can obviously have multiple MPIDs or multiple shortcodes if we're talking a supplier party. So you don't need to group just to have multiple MPIDs, as long as they're all registered to the same party. Grouping comes in if you've got, I guess it's typically either through a merger or some of the larger suppliers who, obviously over time have grown and have just, ended up with multiple licensed entities where that comes in. Hopefully that answers that one. Keep me honest if I don't. Second one, so the overall score dashboard as a party, just your position, and it'll show you your position over time. So you've got a few dots on the XY. PAB members see all parties. We would like to move towards that, including all party data, initially on an anonymized basis, so in a sort of peer comparison way. But we recognize, particularly that aggregation of scores, which, always has some complexity to it. Parties haven't seen that view before. We absolutely expect people will want to engage with the dashboards a bit, understand the data a bit more. There will no doubt be, questions that you've got. And as a result of that, we're not going to make that available from day one. We're going to work obviously with the feedback we receive from parties as you engage with the dashboards, and then at some point we will look to kind of take the path through. This is what we've done, this is what we think is right, and we'll move to a position where on that overall score you will see your dot, and then you'll see a anonymized everybody else dot, and then I think eventually we'd like to get to a point where we can just have the whole thing open, but I think that's some time away yet. So that will go through PAB governance to make that choice. So that's number 1. So I think that covers that one. Yeah. In terms of exporting, so we have been looking at this. It's not going to be available on day one, unfortunately, because there's some complexities around it. But we recognise there might be some scenarios where you might want to export. I mean, clearly you can screenshot, right? I mean, if you're wanting to, put something in a deck or something where you're, updating something internally. What we're trying to see whether we can enable is the ability for you to export that detailed meter point or other exception list, which I would imagine is where the question comes from. Because if I was a party and I saw something in that list, I'd want to be able to take it away and go do that. That's unfortunately not going to be available on day one, but it is something we are looking at, and we'll keep you updated on that. Is there a way we can see any accounts that have been rejected as confirmed theft? So I think this basically means where you've reported it in, but we've said, okay, we, for whatever reason, not counted it as confirmed theft, and that, I mean, that's only really if we've got a problem with the data. We don't sort of sit there in judgment over these things. So that isn't something that we've got in the current dashboards. You will be able to see how many confirmed thefts we've attributed. So obviously, if that's different to what you've suggested, I can see the value in that suggestion. So it's probably certainly something we should put on our backlog and think about whether there is a way of doing that, because obviously that might allow you to self-serve the immediate question you would ask, which is, you've got, I'll make up a number, we're seeing 100 in the report, we thought we had 150, you know, what's going on at the moment? Obviously you would need to engage with the performance assurance team to go, can you help me understand the 50? So can definitely see the value in that suggestion. Won't be there on day one, but good suggestion, we'll put it in the backlog. So thank you for that. Are we able to offer guidance on what performance metrics? Yeah. Sorry, Paul.
I think these last two are one question combined.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So sorry. Let me read them as a combined question, then I'll try and answer it. So, guidance. What performance metrics? Okay. So if this is around performance metrics for SLAs, then that is a service provider specific question. So that will be in the service provider session, which is on Friday.
Yeah, Friday.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So yeah, qualitative and quantitative SLAs is a service provider specific item, and that will come up in that session. More generally, and obviously we can touch on it a little bit, but deliberately didn't go into the detail because this was more about the what are the dashboards, where are they, kind of how do they work, I guess. As a party, if you're looking at, and particularly the risk related things, which I think are probably the ones that are most complicated. As I say, a lot of that detail is in the risk register, it's in some of the other performance assurance documents on the portal, it's in some of the webinars we've run before. So we'll kind of pull all of those links together so that they can be shared with people, because, you know, as I say, you know, people are obviously constantly changing roles. You may not have been to all those webinars before, or it may have just been some time. And then I would imagine what we'll probably find is once people have had the dashboards, probably not in the first sort of post go live session, which is next week, because I don't think you'll have time, frankly, to, you know, really get into the weeds of it. So I think that first one is much more kind of, you know, operational, or like, you know, I can't access this, or this doesn't seem to be working type issues. But I think probably after a few weeks, and people have had a chance to have a bit more of a kick around with the data, I would imagine we'll start to have some more questions, and we'll look to have some engagement on that. The exact form of that, I think, we might need to see the sorts of questions we're getting, because it might be it's clear a general webinar is helpful. It might be that the questions are so specific to your data that it's not something suitable for a, you know, large forum type meeting like this, and we need to do a series of individual engagement sessions. So we're sort of reserving judgment on what the right option is there until we get a little bit more feedback. Hopefully that answers that question, and possibly the question I wasn't asked as well.
Excellent. Well, that is all the questions so far. There's still plenty of time though. So if anyone wanted to just take the time to go on and log any final questions, that would be great. I guess while we wait for any final questions, just wanted to reconfirm what we said at the start, that we've been recording this session today, and we'll make the recording available with the slides certainly before the end of the week on the Rec portal, and we'll send a link out to it in the weekly bulletin so that you can share it with your colleagues. A reminder as well that the Rec service provider session, as just mentioned, is happening this Friday, and there's still time to sign up for that if you are a service provider who thinks there'll be value in coming along to that one, or you know of a service provider who might not be aware of the session, you want to share the information with them. And then it was also mentioned at the start as well today that after go live, planned for Friday of next week, there is a post go live drop-in session where, once you've been using these tools in anger, you can come along and ask any questions that you've got. More of a, I think Andrew, the intent to be more of an open forum session.
Yeah.
No real agenda from our side, but an opportunity for you to come along.
Yeah, we've run those, I think, a couple of times before, where it is, and sometimes I think they're in for 2 hours, and you tend to find there's a peak at the beginning, and then it sort of you know, kind of drops away. But it's really an opportunity just to come into an open forum and sort of be, oh, this doesn't seem to be working as I thought, or I don't really understand how I do this, or can you just run me through that dashboard again? I mean, like, there's been a lot of information in this meeting. you know, and I'm conscious we've been looking at the dashboards for a while, but you know, this is obviously new to everybody else on the call. So you know, there's lots to take away from this. So you might just be like, actually, just play that with me again, and maybe you want to sit there and, you know, on another screen be clicking away in your dashboard while we're talking about it in a sort of generic sense. So you know, very much more that sort of style. And then I think, as I say, slightly longer term, once people have had a proper chance to delve into the data, we might then have some slightly different sorts of questions about the data rather than the dashboards in that sense. And we're just going to see how that plays out. But overall, you know, our aim here really is we want to be open about the data we're looking at. So, you know, this is the data we see. Our teams use the same dashboards you guys are seeing, right? So, you know, there's not sort of a sort of separate behind the scenes set of data. And really the purpose of doing that is, you know, we want you to understand what we're seeing, and therefore, you know, that hopefully you'll see why certain performance assurance decisions are made. We want you to have the opportunity to look at the data, and I know a number of parties have asked us this in the past and sort of go, well, actually, you know, I don't want to wait for the performance assurance team to decide they want to come do something. Like, I want to be on top of my own data, right? If I can see that something's you know, apparently not right, I'd like to understand why that is, and whether that is that, you know, I need to do something as a party, I need to engage with one of my, you know, kind of agents or you know, kind of you know, the sort of suppliers, third parties, whatever, or whether I need to go back and say, like, this is looking like I'm not doing well here, but I think we're really, you know, actually top quartile on this. Like, can we understand why you're seeing this? You know, that proactivity, you know, great, and we'd really obviously encourage. You know, we want to be open with the data we're looking at, you know, subject obviously to all the right controls, so that, you know, people can sort of be engaged and be proactive about that, and we'd encourage people to do that.
Thanks, Andrew. I suspect we're not going to get any more questions. So before I lose too many people, what I will ask you to do on the call today, if you have the opportunity now, I'm just going to flick over to the next slide, and that's going to open up a poll on Slido. So if you're logged into Slido, if you can log in now for me, please, on slido.com with the code there. Just 2 really short questions, just asking you to let us know whether you got some value from today's session, and if you have the opportunity and any comments as well about giving some feedback about how we could run these better, or things that you particularly enjoyed the way we run it. I'd really appreciate just a couple minutes of your time to fill in that survey. But I think all that remains for me to say is to thank you to Andrew, and thank you to Ben for the overview and the demonstration today. I really look forward to speaking to more of you on the dashboards, perhaps to see you at next week's drop-in session as well. But until then, thank you very much to all, and have a very nice evening.